Welcome to Century Communications Public Affairs Special, the new union movement. Is there a new union movement? Did you know in the 50s that 35% of us were members of unions? People at that time felt that the unions offered you job security and a living wage. But today, 14 to 15% of us are in unions. Some people feel that's why the have-nots and the haves, the gap is getting greater, and that taxes have changed to favor the rich. We're not going to comment on it, but there's 17 million Americans who are in unions today, and about 2 million in the great state of California. Joining me are 4 people who believe in unions, and we'll hear their perspective on it. Maria Elena Durazo is president of the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Local 11, and also had been a personal best guest of mine. Good to have you, Maria Elena. Michael Feinstein, a council member from the city of Santa Monica. It's interesting to have an elected official here and see what his point of view is. The Reverend William Campbell, who's an organizer with the Clergy and Laity, United for Economic Justice. Good to have you, Reverend. And Harold Myerson from the LA Weekly, who has a point of view that is somewhat supportive of unions. Let's just start with you, Maria Elena. You are with the Service Employees. What is that union?
We represent the hotel and restaurant workers all across the city of Los Angeles, the maids that clean the rooms, and the cooks and the servers, the dishwashers, the bellmen. Those are the folks that our mission is to organize and raise their standard of living.
And part of your mission historically was to let the people know around the country that LA had a problem. You created a video that said this is not the greatest city. That was pretty negative at the time. A lot of people thought divisive. But what has happened since then?
Well, I would say in terms of that video, our message was a lot broader than just saying this city was no good. Our message was that this city had to make a decision, that if it continued to go down the path of treating workers, continuing to put them permanently into a state of poverty, dead-end jobs with no training, no opportunities, then things like the riots were going to continue to happen. And we had a choice to make, and since then, we believe through our movement that we're creating and other unions are creating that we're forcing the debate to go into the other direction, which is to provide good jobs for service workers.
You know, management always says, sure, fine, great, but it's the margins of profits we have to deal with. It's the cash flows we have to deal with. And one of the things we have to keep under control are costs. And one of the costs that we can keep under control are employees. How do you, argue a point that you need a profit to keep a business going, and that unions sometimes strangle that goal of entrepreneur?
Well, I don't think it has anything to do with the strangling. The workers need and the unions need for these businesses to survive and to do well. It is not in the interest of workers and the unions to run businesses, run them out of business. It's our interest to make them successful, but it can be done, and it's done throughout this country. In cities where there's high unionization, the cities do very, very well. You take San Francisco, you take Hawaii, you take New York. The most successful tourist cities in this country, and the workers are paid $3, $4, $5 an hour more than they're paid here in Los Angeles.
What are they paid?
A housekeeper in San Francisco makes almost $12 an hour.
And what do they make here?
In Los Angeles, she makes $8 an hour. And these are union standards, because if you go into a non-union hotel, they're making $5, $6, and $7 an hour. No health coverage, no pension, no other benefits, and more importantly, they have no rights on the job to speak up for themselves.
Now explain Mayor Reardon. He is a businessman, he is a Republican, but yet you seem to have forged an alliance with him.
Because I believe that Mayor Reardon believes that in order for Los Angeles to be a successful city, that we have to have good middle-class jobs, and that the unions play a role in leveling the playing field. Unions are really the only way in which workers have a shot at making their jobs real middle-class jobs. And I think that through the last several years, he's become to understand that and believe in that more when he sees that we act very reasonably in what we request, what we fight for from the employers. We act very reasonably. We're not asking for things that are impossible or that run companies out of business.
Michael, you're an elected official in Santa Monica. What brings you to this particular show? Why are you here?
Well, Santa Monica is committed to sustainability, a healthy lifestyle. For all of our community members to be healthy, they have to have the tools to sustain themselves. I don't think it's a balanced system that we have in Santa Monica. Let's look at our hotel industry. We are making 600 to 700 million gross on the visitor industry in Santa Monica. We're making a lot of money at the top. The city gets $13 million a year on the bed tax. It's not clear, however, that the housekeepers in the hotel, the people at the bottom of the ladder, are sharing in that success. Elena said it's $7 an hour in LA. Excuse me, $8 an hour in LA, it's less than $7 an hour in Santa Monica. The fact that people aren't sharing in the overall success isn't good for them, it isn't good for the city. How
do you know overall success? I mean, won't management or ownership say to you, look, I need my margins, I got to have a profit, I need the profit to reinvest into my hotel and to look to the future, and one of the ways in which I can keep that margin is keeping wages low.
Santa Monica has an 83% occupancy rate. It's one of the highest in the country. Our hotels are doing very well. And we recall Henry Ford said in the 20s, unless the people earn enough money to buy the cars, nobody's going to buy the cars, nothing's going to work. And also, for myself as a council member, we have two twin goals. We want to have affordable housing so people who work in our city can live there, but we also want people who work in our city to have enough money to live in the area. Sustainable urban planning all revolves around that, so we all have to do our part.
Okay, what is your part as an elected official? What can you do about the issues surrounding the hotels and the workers?
Well, you know, from the planning side in terms of affordable housing, I can do policy sort of things. That's right within my job description. But when there are extraordinary situations, like we think is the situation in Santa Monica, where a whole community coalition called Santa Monicans Allied for Responsible Tourism, or SMART, has gotten together because we feel, as unions have tried to organize in Santa Monica or have tried to protect the one union hotel at the Sheraton Miramar, management has not been very friendly to that. In those sort of cases where especially there is this disparity of wealth and power, I think it's the role in an extraordinary situation of a public official to call that out and call attention to that. And myself and some of the other council members in Santa Monica have been doing just that.
And doing just that, what hotels are we talking about and what are the issues?
Well, there are 5 luxury hotels in Santa Monica, and only one of them is unionized. So at that hotel, a lot of people have been very concerned that the management has been trying to break the union. We've actually put on a hearing in the city to have the workers come forward and say their side. Unfortunately, management didn't choose to say their side. So number one there, because when people are trying to stand up against a multinational, they need community support. Also, in a lot of the other hotels, we're trying to raise the issue that management needs to stay neutral so that if the workers are going to go ahead and try and organize, that they let them go ahead and do so according to the law. We're trying to have the sunshine on that situation so that at least it's a level playing field and that workers have a fair chance to decide who they want to represent them.
Okay, what arguments do you get from the hotel management that suggests that the strategy you're using is meddling and getting into private sector profit issues?
Well, clearly, there are always people who think in economics, oh, any sort of intervention is, playing with the free market. But clearly, we have regulations left and right. We try and use social goals to influence how markets are going. I'm coming from the perspective that we really need to look at the labor situation as well from that perspective. Management doesn't like it, but that's too bad. I'm elected. I'm elected for this reason because I represented a point of view.
Reverend, what is your group, your organization, and how does it play within this issue?
CLUE, for Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, is an organization of both clergy and laity. It's interfaith, interracial, interdenominational. We have persons from the Christian community, both the Catholic and Protestant. We have persons from the Roman Catholic community. We have persons from the Islamic community. We first came about almost 2 years ago in giving attention to the issue of the living wage. As we looked at the living wage, we recognized that persons being paid the minimum wage were still beneath the poverty level. They were persons who were working, the working poor, yet they did not have health insurance and health benefits, and they were, because of the level they were being paid, were yet eligible to receive Medi-Cal. They were yet eligible to receive welfare. And it also meant not only were they eligible and did it require the government to continue to support them or subsidize them, it also meant that their families were undermined in terms of if you do not have sufficient income to really be able to meet your family's needs, it undermined family. my own personal family, my wife and I, we've been blessed to have 3 children who are now at the college level and beyond. But we know that as they went through elementary school, junior high school, and high school, there were numerous activities that were part of their educational experience we had to help pay for out of our pocket, even though they were in the public schools.
Okay, so what does your group do now in impacting with this issue?
Okay, with that understanding, we began to take a strong look at what was going on in terms of the level of pay. And as we looked at it and began to realize these problems, we began, one, to communicate in Los Angeles to the council people, to communicate to our congregations, to be in conversations with people within our congregations, because we have within our congregations both owners and employers as well as employees, and began to communicate the whole sense of the integrity of it, the moral issue of it. There's a passage of scripture that says the worker is worthy of his or her hire. But if what the worker is being paid is much less than is needed to sustain, then you're undermining the community.
Okay, but saying that, what is the minimum a person should be paid that's considered a living wage, and how do you then answer the question if we got a very slim margin of profit that in fact you might cause a business not to be successful?
Okay, in Los Angeles, the living wage was ultimately passed at $7.50 an hour plus health care benefits, or at $8.50 an hour without the health care benefits, which would then provide the kinds of funds to be able to meet family needs as well as to have health care, as well as not to deny children health care. See, that's the other part of it. Because of the depressed wage, children were going without receiving medical attention.
Sure.
The person who was working was not inclined to take their child to the LA County USC Medical Center to receive care, because they wanted to live as a person with dignity and to work, but then have to say, I've got to look to the government to care for my children.
What do you say to a small businessman who says, I just can't afford it. I can't afford that kind of cost?
First of all, at the rate that the living wage was established in Los Angeles was based upon businesses that were receiving money from the city. The business person was a business person who was receiving a subsidy already from the city. And therefore saying that if the city is going to support you, then you have a responsibility to do right by the people that work for you.
Okay, Harold, the West Side, we're here in the West Side right now. The hotels that Maria Elena Durazo is talking about, we're downtown. The West Side doesn't have, it doesn't seem to me anyhow, to have unions within those hotels. Do they or don't they?
Some do, some don't. Maria Elena's Local 11 has contracts with hotels downtown, but also Beverly Hills. Hotels like the Century Plaza, the Beverly Hilton, the Beverly Wilshire, the Bel Air. Do have a contract with Maria Elena's Local 11, which expires in April. The hotels in Santa Monica that Michael referred to, by and large, do not have contracts, with the exception of the Sheraton Miramar. What happened with the contract, which I think is a rather groundbreaking contract, that Local 11 signed with a number of downtown hotels, and a few hotels elsewhere too, is that they agreed to some very significant raises for some workers, I think, who greatly deserved it. Housekeepers getting, over the 6-year life of the contract, a raise that would take the base pay from about $16,000 something to about $23,000 something. But the same language has not yet been embraced by hotels, which frankly, if you look at just the rough business figures, seem to be able to afford it better than the hotels that have already signed on. Hotels like the Beverly Hilton, the Century Plaza, the Bel Air, and so on have higher room rates and higher occupancy rates than hotels like the Biltmore and the Hyatt Regency downtown, which have already signed on to this. So it's hard for me, looking at this as a journalist, to see what the economic issue is for these West Side hotels.
Okay, as a journalist, why did the union movement in the 50s, 35 to 40% of the people were in unions, go down to 14, 15% today? And what's your sense of John Sweeney and the new, what seems to be the new union movement?
The labor movement that came out of World War II, which had grown greatly in the 30s with the legalization of unions under the Wagner Act, which Franklin Roosevelt signed, and then during the war, was really a powerful force that went for a while, fairly unchallenged by employers. And then over the years, beginning in the 60s, there was greater and greater employer resistance to unionization. When the Wagner Act was passed, this was not really envisioned. There were some relatively nominal sanctions placed in the law that would seem to discourage employers from violating it. But in fact, what's happened in recent decades is that during organizing drives, for instance, most studies show that 1 of about every 20 workers in organizing drives are fired. Now, this is illegal under the terms of the National Labor Relations Act, which is the other name for the Wagner Act.
Yeah.
But it's common practice because the punishment for doing this to an employer is nothing. I mean, you pay a fine.
The politics of unions, I mean, weren't they strong? Didn't they impact Democrats and moderate Republicans?
Totally.
But they're not there today.
They are coming back, and I would make the case, for instance, that the reason the fast track was defeated in the last session of Congress is because John Sweeney has put together a much more effective union movement than was around when NAFTA passed 4 years before that, and the AFL-CIO was headed by Lane Kirkland. I think that made a huge difference in their ability to mobilize and get message out. They were just much more effective. But in general, I think the polarization in incomes, the relative decline in working class wages is substantially the result of the weakening of unions over the last 40 years. And in this, I think some of the old guard leadership that nationally people like John Sweeney have replaced, and locally the people like Elena have replaced, was somewhat complicit in this. They were just asleep at the job. George Meany was once quoted as saying, well, the organized fella is the fella that counts. That means we can get good contracts for our guys. We don't really have to worry about organizing. And in fact, the total amount of funds that unions spent on organizing was dwindling down to about 2 or 3% of their entire budget. Sweeney comes in and says, this is nuts. We've got to get it up to 30%. And activities like that are things that Elena in her local initiated here before John Sweeney was even saying this.
And Elena, politics is part of your process, and there are 2 things that have just happened that certainly put a feather in your cap. But one was charter reform. There was this whole ballot measure, and we all voted for these 15 folks. And the unions endorsed certain members in each of these districts, and you ended up winning the majority of those candidates that you backed. And secondly, there was just this race in the Assembly where Gil Cedillo won in the 46th, and he had some formidable opponents, but again, organized labor flexed the muscle and won. So you're on a roll right now.
That's right, and it all should be, and from our point of view, is aimed at protecting the right to organize. And that's what's really at the heart of it. We need to elect officials that are going to protect the workers' right to organize, because it is not taking place. Right now, employers can just, one after another, fire, discipline, harass the Sheraton Miramar, the Neotani. You have case after case, and we need elected officials who are going to stand up for the rights of the workers to organize. And that was our primary concern with Gilbert Cedillo. We wanted somebody who was not going to be wishy-washy about the right of a worker to organize, which then leads to contracts like the one we just settled, in which, for example, in Gilbert's district, the majority of which are immigrants. The success of Gilbert's campaign is owed to new immigrants becoming citizens in the last year to 2 years and voting in twice the percentage of other voters, even the consistent voters. But what we're winning in contracts is beyond what is very important, the wages and the working conditions and their benefits, but it's also issues that are beyond the workplace. For example, immigration. We want an immigration clause in our contract that we've won with these first group of 6 hotels, which says that because of all the bureaucracy, because of all the complicated changes in the immigration law, workers who are here legally, but whose work permits expire, right? They're fired, and that's it. You could be there 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you're fired. Well, what we won was protection. They are protected for 1 to 2 years in their jobs, seniority, benefits, or position, because of what is taking place with immigration. The worker then looks at the union movement as looking at the totality of their lives. We got a clause which says that if hotels employ workfare, welfare to work recipients, that they will get the same wages, the same working conditions, the same benefits, and they're not going to be used as slave labor or subcontracted out labor to lower the standard for workers in this industry.
What's your agenda for the 1998 elections? We have this open primary June 2nd. You're obviously going to pick candidates that you're going to endorse for various things. What are you looking for out of this process?
Well, one, I think a combination, particularly in the primary, is to do whatever we can to defeat the anti-union initiative that's on the ballot. And this is one which would apply only to the unions, and it doesn't apply to the corporations as far as limiting our ability to raise funds from members.
Doesn't it, this measure that workers can make a personal decision if they want any of their dues to go toward candidates, is what the initiative says?
No, it goes far beyond that. For example, it says that the employer has to agree and give permission for the workers then to contribute to a union's political funds. What does that have to do with a worker's personal choice? And the other thing is that it should apply the other way towards the businesses. It should say, why shouldn't shareholders individually annually give permission for their funds to be used in political campaigns? So it's only being used against on the unions, and it's not being used against the corporations.
Will that be a litmus test? You're going to ask candidates if they support that initiative or not, and if they do support it, you're not going to be for them?
Absolutely. Sure, it has everything to do with, and we will also be concerned with making sure that strong supporters of the union movement, the right to organize, are also elected.
Michael?
Well, yeah, I mean, and you look at this initiative, you have to get back to the question, why are unions strong and not, and the whole corporate influence on the political process.
Right.
Reagan clearly went after the unions in the 80s. But Harold mentioned NAFTA and GATT. Democrats, many Democrats, not all Democrats, but many Democrats, including the president, push these very anti-labor trade agreements. They've been in bed with the same movements that have been trying to crush labor. So it's really important that labor and other related forces organize on their own, because they can't take the two large parties for granted. You know, I'm a Green Party organizer. We've been calling attention to this, and that, I think, is the other, element in the equation.
Let's ask you that question. You are Green Party. The Democrats have been traditionally a part of the union. Unions have been part of the Democrats. Not always, but a good number of it. How does the Green Party fit in?
Green Party fits in because, hey, I'm a Green. I stood up for this stuff in Santa Monica. I was backed by local HERE 814 because I was willing to take a stand. There's a lot of interest around the country in forming a separate labor party. I think in many cases the Democrats can't take the labor movement for granted. And labor has to come out and say you can't take us for granted. Sometimes I hope they're going to back good third-party candidates in order to keep the larger parties honest.
Yes, Reverend. How do you play within this issue?
One of the things that came forth in Mary Elena's observation of the last contract, dealing with workfare, for example. Workfare is the requirement that the Department of Public Social Services has that requires persons who receive any type of benefit assistance. Initially, it was general relief. And it's also being projected in terms of the new Cal Works program to work a certain number of hours. We've had situations where persons were required to do work where they did not have health care protection, they did not have training for the jobs that they had to do, they did not have certain basic protections, persons being required to handle certain type of toxic materials and not having gloves and the proper training. There was no one to speak for them. Now we have the unions saying that if you're going to bring persons into the workplace, there's a need to respect their humanity, that it does not matter whether or not they are compensated directly by the employer or whether or not they're coming into the workplace being compensated by the government. There's a basic affirmation of human rights that needs to take place. And so to have a voice to be able to speak up and to have it built into the contract so that those interests are well regarded. And so those are the kinds of issues that, again, we're concerned about that have to do with basic issues of morality, basic issues of ethics, basic issues of having just a sense of respect for a person's humanity. And so it's at that point we affirm what Local 11 was able to do and what it means in terms of the health of our community.
Harold, as he speaks there, you don't see much of what he says on television or in the newspapers. What has been the role, you're a journalist, of the media in the last 20, 30 years with this union notion, and where are they today?
Like some old guard union leadership, they were asleep on this issue, if not utterly indifferent and somewhat contemptuous. The labor beat on most major American newspapers has largely been discontinued over the last 20 years. A lot of prominent American journalists came out of this beat. Murray Kempton, because labor was considered, you know, in the Meany Kirkland era, nothing is happening, it's not sexy. And a class bias within journalism itself, I think, existed as well. That, you know, the action... part of this also emerged, I think, out of the rift over the Vietnam War in the 60s. And people coming to newspapers, you know, had come out of the anti-war movement, tended to be middle class, upper middle class. Labor was both old news, wrong, and... somehow beneath consideration.
Of course, that did impact the labor movement in a dramatic way. Yeah. Now, what about the media today?
The media today is waking up some, not enough. I mean, if you look at like local TV news coverage of what I think is a very significant contract for LA that Maria Elena's local got, it's pretty negligible, but then local TV news coverage, except for shows like this, is pretty negligible on almost anything of importance in this city. I think newspapers are more aware of these issues today, and I think they sense that there's a public groundswell. Things like the level of public support for the UPS strike, things like the level of public support, which in an LA Times poll came out to 70% for the living wage ordinance. So I think there is a kind of broad sense, and there needs to be more of it, that we are moving towards a kind of Dickensian society here, nowhere more so than in this city, and that we need to do something about it. And I think there will be, therefore, some more emphasis on unions in journalism in the next few years, I hope.
Final comment, Maria.
Yes, I would like to very much give recognition to the hotel employers that joined with Local 11 in putting forth a break-new, redefining service sector jobs in this industry. Hotels like the Biltmore, the Omni, the Hyatt Regency, Hyatt West Hollywood, and the Sheraton Universal, the Holiday Inn. Those 6 hotels are to be highly complimented, highly commended for taking leadership in an industry that does not take leadership with regards to workers' rights and workers' working conditions. And I think that's a very, very important recognition to make, and to then, on the other hand, turn around and urge those other hotels that want to hold down the progress of this industry, the prosperity of this industry, by fighting, you know, workers who only want a voice on the job, who only want to make a little bit more decent living for them and their kids and make the city much better, you know, like the ones Harold mentioned.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on this April contract with those hotels that Harold mentioned earlier. I want to thank the 4 of you very much for giving us your impressions, insights, and point of view on this issue. Appreciate that very much. And I want to thank you out there for sharing your time with us. God bless you, and bye-bye.